Dawn crept slowly over the French countryside. A pale mist clung to the hedgerows, swallowing the sound of distant engines. Through the haze, a German Panther commander raised his binoculars and froze. Across the valley, a line of American Shermans stood motionless, their silhouettes black against the early light. More appeared behind them, spread perfectly across the fields, turrets pointed east. The commander grinned. After days of retreat, there was a chance to strike back. He ordered his gunner to load armor-piercing rounds. The barrels turned toward the shapes in the fog, but something felt wrong. The tanks weren't moving. No heat shimmer from their engines, no crew figures in the turrets. The German officer hesitated, then a radio crackled. Reports from the flank. American half-tracks spotted on their right, no. Behind them. By the time the first Panther fired, the Shermans ahead were collapsing, not exploding, deflating. And from the ridge behind, real American armor opened fire. What the Germans thought was an enemy column was nothing but canvas, air, and brilliance. The deception that morning would mark one of the most ingenious maneuvers of the Western Front. By late summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe had reached a strange crossroads. The Allies had broken out from Normandy after weeks of brutal hedgerow fighting. Paris was liberated. The German army was in retreat but not defeated. For months, the momentum that had carried American and British forces across France began to slow. Fuel shortages stretched supply lines, and relentless German counterattacks turned the race to the Rhine into a grinding struggle of attrition. Behind every village and forest edge, German rearguards made a stand. Panther and Tiger tanks lurked in ambush, using terrain to their advantage. Each advance became costly, each crossroads a potential trap. By autumn, the optimism of summer had hardened into exhaustion. American infantrymen, many just months out of training camps, now faced seasoned Wehrmacht divisions fighting for every meter of ground. Commanders needed new ways to break the deadlock methods that didn't rely solely on firepower. That need gave rise to something the Germans never expected: art as a weapon. The idea took root within the U.S. Army's top leadership even before D-Day. Allied planners knew the Germans excelled at defense. They could quickly shift reserves wherever an attack seemed strongest. The key to breaking through wasn't just to strike hard, but to strike where they weren't looking. To achieve that, deception became a strategy. The British had already used it with devastating effect from Operation Fortitude, the fake invasion force that convinced Hitler the Allies would land at Pas de Calais, to dummy landing craft and false radio chatter. The Americans saw its potential and wanted their own dedicated unit, a formation capable not of fighting with bullets, but with illusions. Thus, in early 1944, the U.S. Army activated a secret organization under the bland name 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Its mission was unlike any other in military history: to impersonate entire divisions, complete with fake armor, false headquarters, and fabricated radio networks to draw enemy fire away from real units and create openings where none existed. What made the 23rd remarkable was not just its mission, but who filled its ranks. Instead of typical soldiers, the unit drew from America's artists, designers, sound engineers, and radio specialists. Men who had once painted billboards, built stage sets, or studied at art schools in New York were now crafting inflatable tanks and portable sound trucks. They were trained to create the perfect illusion: visual deception, inflatable Shermans, jeeps and artillery positioned to mimic an entire armored column; auditory deception, massive loudspeakers mounted on half-tracks could broadcast the sounds of tanks clanking, engines roaring and troops shouting audible for miles; radio deception, skilled operators mimicked real division traffic, down to the smallest procedural detail, fooling German signal intelligence. The Germans, masters of camouflage and counterintelligence, prided themselves on reading the battlefield. The thought that the Americans might turn deception into a full-scale operational art never crossed their minds. That was about to change. By October 1944, the U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton was pushing toward the German border. The Siegfried Line, a fortress of bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and pillboxes, blocked their path. Here, the 23rd Special Troops found their calling. Patton's divisions were stretched thin, and German reconnaissance planes constantly monitored Allied movements. A single misdirection could save thousands of lives if done correctly. So along the muddy roads near the Moselle River, the Ghost Army staged one of its most daring acts. Dozens of inflatable Shermans were erected overnight under cover of darkness. Canvas tents marked false command posts. Radio operators began transmitting fake divisional chatter. By dawn, German observers reported a massive armored buildup in the sector just as planned. Yet behind the spectacle, the real armored force was moving silently to the flank hidden in forests and valleys. The Germans prepared to attack what they thought was the main U.S. thrust. Instead, they were walking straight into a trap, and that trap, using nothing but air, sound, and human ingenuity, would become one of the most astonishing feats of tactical deception of World War II. For the men inside German Panthers and Tigers, the war in the West had become a test of endurance. They had once been the kings of armored warfare, the iron spearhead that had crushed Europe under Blitzkrieg. But by late 1944, that glory was fading. Fuel was scarce. Replacement parts were harder to find than ammunition. Allied air power ruled the skies, striking anything that moved by day. Still, the tank crews of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS clung to their machines with near religious devotion. To them, a Panther wasn't just steel, it was pride, survival, and proof that German engineering still commanded respect. They knew that in a straight fight, few American Shermans could match them. Their 75mm high-velocity guns could pierce a Sherman's frontal armor at over a kilometer. But they also knew something else. America's real advantage wasn't the tank. It was numbers, mobility, and ingenuity. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had become a chess game of appearances. The Germans relied heavily on intelligence aerial reconnaissance, intercepted radio signals, and reconnaissance patrols. Every movement the Allies made was observed, analyzed, and reported to higher command. But what happens when what you see isn't real? This question haunted German field commanders as Allied deception efforts grew more sophisticated. They had already been fooled at a massive scale just months earlier. Operation Fortitude had convinced Hitler that the Normandy landings were only a diversion. When the real invasion came at Normandy, German panzer reserves sat idle near Calais for weeks, waiting for an attack that never came. Now, on the ground in France, deception wasn't just a strategic tool, it had become tactical, almost intimate. Every empty field could hide a division. Every line of radio chatter could belong to ghosts. And in the cold pre-dawn hours, even the sharpest German eye could be deceived. The American 23rd Headquarters Special Troops operated under absolute secrecy. Its roughly 2,100 men were divided into 4 key components. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers, responsible for inflatable vehicles and decoys. The 3102nd Signal Service Company, Special, radio operators who forged entire networks of phantom units. The 406th Combat Engineers, experts in logistics, concealment, and rapid setup. The 3103rd Signal Company, Sonic the Sound Magicians, armed with giant speakers and pre-recorded tank noises. Together, they could simulate an entire armored division of nearly 20,000 men in less than a day. To the Germans watching from the other side of the line, it looked, sounded, and even felt real. They learned to deploy at night, often just a few miles from the front. Soldiers worked in total darkness, inflating dummy tanks and artillery with portable air compressors. The next morning, reconnaissance aircraft would photograph convincing columns of Shermans and half-tracks, exactly where Allied commanders wanted the enemy to believe they were. In November 1944, as winter crept across Europe, German defenses along the Moselle and Saar rivers stiffened. Intelligence suggested that American forces were concentrating near a series of small villages east of Nancy. In truth, it was a faint part of a deception designed to cover Patton's real drive toward Metz in the Saar industrial region. The Ghost Army was assigned to simulate the 6th Armored Division, complete with fake tanks, radio signals, and convoy noise. If they could convince the Germans that a large armored thrust was forming in one sector, it would pull enemy armor away from the true attack route. The operation demanded precision. The dummy tanks had to be visible enough for aerial reconnaissance, yet realistic under close observation. Their crews rehearsed the placement, angle, and shadow direction to ensure no two looked identical, details that could betray an illusion. It was artistry under fire. On the German side, Reports began flooding in. American armor sighted near St. Nicola. Sherman Company assembling east of the forest line. Panther units were ordered to move at first light to intercept. Crews cleaned their guns, loaded ammunition, and studied the maps by lantern glow. They believed they were preparing for a decisive tank engagement. But the truth unseen, silent and airborne, was unfolding all around them. In the nearby woods, the real American armored battalions were moving into position under blackout conditions, guided only by compasses and whispered commands. Their engines remained cold until the very last moment. The dummy force was ready, perfectly arranged across the open ground, an irresistible target. By the time the first sunlight cut through the fog, the stage was set for one of the most astonishing tactical performances of the war. The actors were soldiers. The props were inflatable tanks. And the audience, the most dangerous tank crews in Europe, had no idea they were watching a play. The Ghost Army's success relied not just on equipment, but on psychology. Their real weapon wasn't the inflatable tank, it was believed. If they could make the Germans believe they were facing an armored division, then the illusion had already won. Deception in war is as old as conflict itself, from Sun Tzu's teachings to Wellington's feints at Waterloo. But in 1944 it took on a modern industrial form. The battlefield had become a canvas of perception, and the men of the 23rd Special Troops were its artists. When executed together, these elements created something that no amount of firepower could achieve: uncertainty. For a soldier inside a tank, uncertainty is poison. One moment of hesitation, 1 second of doubt about what's real, can be fatal. The Germans had long relied on reconnaissance superiority. Their intelligence officers prided themselves on accurate, timely reports. But deception turned that strength into a weakness. The more confident they were in what they saw, the more completely they could be fooled. Aerial photos showed tank shadows exactly where American armor should have been. The radio intercepts confirmed it. And when night brought the rumble of recorded engines echoing across the hills, the deception became reality in the minds of enemy commanders. By dawn, the illusion was total. This psychological manipulation was deliberate. The Ghost Army studied how German units reacted to pressure when they advanced, when they withdrew, how they redeployed. Their goal was to provoke action, not confusion, to make the enemy move. Every time a German column shifted toward a phantom division, it meant fewer tanks facing real American troops somewhere else. Deception was no longer passive camouflage. It was an active, aggressive form of warfare. At its core, battlefield deception was about shaping the terrain of decision-making. In military theory, every commander makes choices based on limited information: what's seen, what's reported, what's assumed. The Ghost Army operated in that invisible space between reality and assumption. They learned to manipulate what the enemy thought was happening. For example, when an infantry unit was preparing to cross a river, the Ghost Army would stage an armored buildup several kilometers away. German artillery and armor would redeploy to face the fake crossing, leaving the real attack path lightly defended. In another case near the Moselle, dummy artillery batteries drew counter-battery fire for hours, sparing real gun positions from destruction. These were not small tricks. They altered the balance of battles. The dummy tanks themselves were lightweight rubber frames that could be inflated in minutes. Soldiers carried them in duffel bags, unfolding and inflating them with portable air compressors. From a distance or from the air, they looked indistinguishable from real Shermans. Crews even added mud and tread marks to enhance realism. To a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot flying at 1,000 meters, the illusion was perfect. And so when German Panther crews prepared for battle at dawn, they weren't reacting to ghosts, they were reacting to information. Information the Ghost Army had crafted for them. If sight was deception's first sense, sound was its second. The U.S. Army's 3133rd Sonic Company developed mobile sound units capable of projecting realistic battlefield noises up to 15 miles away. They recorded the sounds of Sherman engines, half-tracks, and even tank destroyers under various conditions. Using giant speakers mounted on half-tracks, they could simulate the advance of an entire armored battalion. At night, the rumble of these sounds rolled through the fog, echoing off valley walls. To German sentries, it was unmistakable armor on the move. It was this mastery of sensory illusion that gave the Ghost Army its unmatched credibility. Even veteran German units hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front couldn't easily distinguish reality from illusion in the chaos of night and fog. And when that illusion was timed with precision, as it was near the Moselle, the results could be devastating. Captured German reports later revealed just how convincing these operations were. Panzer commanders described U.S. armored concentrations that simply vanished overnight. Others wrote of phantom divisions that moved faster than logistics could explain. One officer even noted that the enemy appears to have more tanks than he can possibly supply with fuel. He was right, because half of those tanks were filled with air. This created a growing paranoia among German intelligence officers. Every new sighting was questioned. Every radio intercept doubted. And in warfare, hesitation is the enemy of action. That hesitation, born from illusion, would prove fatal. When the real American armor struck from an unexpected direction, they were soldiers, but not the kind history books usually remember. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops carried paintbrushes before rifles, microphones instead of mortars. Many came from art schools, advertising studios, and Hollywood backlots. They weren't trained to destroy. They were trained to convince. To them, deception wasn't trickery, it was survival. Every illusion that worked meant fewer graves, fewer letters home, fewer young men bleeding on the fields of France. It was warfare redesigned by artists. Among them was Bill Blass, a young fashion designer who would later become one of America's leading couturiers. During the war, he painted camouflage patterns on canvas tanks and drew maps for phantom divisions. Others included Ellsworth Kelly, who would later become a world-renowned abstract painter, and Arthur Singer, a wildlife illustrator whose sketches of birds once adorned field manuals. Their backgrounds gave them a unique perspective on war. They saw the battlefield not as chaos, but as a stage one that could be lit, shaped, and framed to control what the enemy saw. They spoke of deception as performance, a carefully staged act designed to hold the audience's attention long enough for the real battle to unfold elsewhere. This was theater, but with the highest possible stakes. Operations were planned like productions. Each deception had a script, a set, and actors. The sound trucks were the orchestra. The radio teams were in dialogue. The camouflage engineers were stage designers, inflating scenery in the dark. Officers rehearsed movements, made sure troops appeared to be building camps, cooking, or refueling tanks. Tire tracks were stamped into mud to mimic constant movement. To any German reconnaissance aircraft overhead, it was flawless. Rows of vehicles, tracks in the dirt, supply lines, everything a real division would have. But there was always an underlying tension. Every man knew that discovery meant death. The Ghost Army operated dangerously close to the front lines, sometimes within artillery range. If the Germans realized the deception and attacked, the consequences would be catastrophic. Inflatable tanks offered no protection. A single shell could tear through dozens of them in seconds. Despite that, the men worked calmly, often under the glow of blackout lamps. Inflating, arranging, disguising, while the real armored units rumbled silently to the flank. There was also a strange ethical tension at the heart of their mission. These men were saving lives through deceit. Their victories came not from courage and combat, but from illusion. Some soldiers later described a quiet unease at the idea that they were fighting a different kind of war, one without heroism or direct confrontation. Yet as casualties mounted across Europe, that hesitation gave way to pride. Because deception, they realized, wasn't cowardice. It was intelligence and compassion too. Every time they fooled the Germans into attacking air-filled tanks instead of men, lives were spared. They weren't tricking for glory. They were tricking for survival. The Ghost Army's operations were among the most classified of the entire war. Their movements were hidden even from nearby Allied units. Infantrymen bivouacked just a few miles away often had no idea that the division beside them was made of rubber and sound. Orders came under strict secrecy. No photographs were allowed. No soldier could speak of what they were doing. When missions ended, they deflated everything, packed up the illusions, and moved on before sunrise, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks and confusion. The secrecy lasted long after the war. For decades, their story remained buried in classified archives. It wasn't until the 1990s that official records were finally declassified, revealing the extent of their deception in more than 20 major operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. Only then did the world learn how artists, engineers, and radio men helped shape the outcome of the war. Technically, the Ghost Army's work was cutting edge. They used engineering creativity in ways that prefigured modern psychological operations. Each inflatable tank was constructed from rubberized canvas, painted with real serial numbers and unit markings. Some were rigged with heat lamps to fool infrared detectors. Their sound systems, using magnetic tape and mobile amplifiers, were among the first portable stereo field systems ever deployed in war. Radio deception, too, was revolutionary. Operators memorized the habits and call signs of actual divisions, transmitting with precise timing to make their traffic indistinguishable from the real thing. Every illusion was a study in human behavior. They understood how the German mind worked, what patterns commanders trusted, what visual cues they looked for, and how to use those instincts against them. The result was more than a trick. It was mind control on the battlefield. Even with all their technology and planning, success still depended on nerves, the ability to act convincingly under pressure. One veteran recalled standing beside a dummy tank at dawn when a German artillery shell landed nearby, ripping open the inflatable hull. Instead of panicking, his team patched it, repainted the hole, and continued the show. They laughed later that day, not from humor, but from disbelief at how close illusion had come to death. These moments defined the unit: creativity under fire, calm under deception, and courage of an unusual kind. Because they knew that the greatest weapon in war isn't always the gun. Sometimes it's imagination used with precision, discipline, and audacity. And that audacity was about to be tested in full. As the night before the operation faded into mist, German tanks moved into the attack position, confident they were about to crush another American advance. They had no idea they were rolling toward a battlefield made of shadows. It was still dark when the German Panther battalions began to move. Engines rumbled to life, exhausting coughing plumes of black smoke into the cold air. Inside the lead tank, the commander checked his map under a dim red light grid coordinates marked near a small French village east of the Moselle River. Reconnaissance had confirmed American armor assembling there overnight. The report mentioned at least 2 companies of Shermans, a handful of half-tracks, and signs of an advancing column. Orders were clear: engage at dawn, destroy the enemy concentration before it can advance. As the first light crept across the valley, fog hung low over the fields. To the Germans, it was the perfect cover. To the Americans, perfect illusion. Across the open ground, a dozen dark shapes stood in still formation, just visible through the haze. Their silhouettes squat, angular, unmistakably Sherman. The Panthers halted. Turrets turned. Range, 800 meters, the gunner called. The commander raised his binoculars. Through the mist, he saw more entire rows of tanks positioned along the hedgerows, glistening with morning dew. It looked like an entire armored regiment waiting for battle. He smiled grimly. Feuer frei. The 75mm high-velocity gun cracked like thunder. A shell screamed across the valley and struck, but instead of a fireball, there was only silence. The target seemed to sag. Canvas tore. Metal poles bent inward. Air hissed out like a dying breath. The tank folded in on itself, deflating slowly until it lay flat on the earth, a lifeless sheet of rubber. The German gunner blinked. "Treffer?" he asked. No explosion, no flames, no secondary blast. The commander lowered his binoculars. The other Shermans remained perfectly still and no one had fired back. Then faintly he heard it, the sound of tank engines, but not from the valley. It came from behind them. From the western ridge, hidden until now, real American armor burst from cover. M4 Shermans and M10 tank destroyers roared forward in coordinated formation. Their guns were already trained on the exposed German flank. The deception had worked flawlessly. The Ghost Army's illusion had drawn the Panthers' attention and their barrels toward an empty field. In the precious minutes they spent engaging dummies, they had turned their sides to the real threat. Within seconds, the battlefield erupted in fire. American gunners, already sighted in, opened up with armor-piercing rounds. Muzzle flashes tore through the fog. The first German tank exploded in a fountain of flame and shrapnel. Another tried to turn, its treads grinding into soft earth, only to be struck through the side armor. The ambush was total. Over the radio, German commanders shouted conflicting orders. Some units demanded artillery support. Others insisted they were under attack from multiple directions. The deception had fragmented their understanding of the battlefield. Panther crews fired blindly at shapes in the mist, convinced they were surrounded. Every sound, every echo seemed like a tank. The Ghost Army's sonic recording still played from distant speakers, projecting the illusion of more Shermans advancing from the front. The Germans didn't realize that what they heard wasn't real. It was recorded noise bouncing across the valley walls. Inside their turrets, tank commanders yelled coordinates, desperately trying to align their guns with phantom targets. But the real shells, the ones striking with deadly precision, came from an unseen direction. It was a psychological collapse, accelerated by gunfire, meant of realization. One German officer, his tank immobilized and smoking, emerged through the hatch and stared at the field ahead. Through the haze, he could see the American tanks lying scattered and lifeless canvas torn open by gunfire, rubber sheets fluttering in the wind. He froze in disbelief. They weren't tanks. They were toys. The truth hit him harder than the shell that had disabled his Panther. They had been fighting ghosts. All around him, the deception unraveled. German soldiers crawled from their vehicles, staring across a field littered not with wreckage, but with deflated illusions, and behind them, the thunder of real American guns rolled closer. The timing of the counterattack was surgical. As soon as German armor turned to face the dummy division, Patton's real armored column concealed behind the ridgeline advanced at full speed. Flanking fire tore through German positions. Infantry followed, clearing out stragglers and securing the high ground. By the time the sun fully rose, the battlefield was decided. It had taken less than an hour. German tankers veterans of Kursk, Kharkov, and Normandy found themselves defeated not by superior weapons, but by superior imagination. When the firing stopped, the valley was quiet again. Smoke drifted through the dawn air. The deflated dummies lay scattered, eerie reminders of how deception had become a weapon as real as any gun. For the Americans, it was victory through illusion. For the Germans, it was humiliation, a battle lost before it truly began. Reports from captured officers later described disbelief, anger, and grudging admiration. One Panther commander reportedly muttered, "We fired at shadows and the shadows bit back." By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its brutal end. But for the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, the mission was far from over. The Allies were closing in on Germany's western border, preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last natural barrier before the heart of the Reich. Every German division still standing was ordered to defend it at all costs. And so once again, illusion became the weapon of choice. This time the stakes were higher. The Germans expected the main crossing at Remagen, where U.S. forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge days earlier. To divert attention, the Ghost Army was ordered to create the illusion of an entire armored division, preparing to cross the Rhine 20 miles north, near the town of Viersen. The deception would involve more than 1,000 men pretending to be 20,000. Under moonlight, trucks rumbled down muddy roads, headlights dimmed. Inside their cargo beds were not soldiers but props, rubber tanks, fake artillery, and wooden trucks fitted with wire frames. By dawn, an entire division began to take shape in the fields outside Viersen. Engineers inflated Sherman tanks with portable air compressors. Others erected fake aircraft made from plywood and canvas. Camouflage nets hung loosely over everything, just enough to fool aerial reconnaissance. From above, Allied reconnaissance planes confirmed the illusion looked flawless. And that meant German reconnaissance planes would see the same. The Ghost Army didn't just build an army, they performed one. Men wore the insignia of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. Jeeps were repainted overnight with false unit numbers. Even the military police at intersections were actors, directing non-existent convoys. For anyone watching through binoculars, through intercepted radio, or through the lens of a spy camera, Viersen was crawling with Allied forces. But deception wasn't visual alone. Sound engineers from the 3132nd Signal Service Company, specialists in acoustic warfare, had spent months recording authentic battlefield noises. Tanks revving, pontoon bridges clanking, cranes lowering equipment, even mess hall chatter. using enormous speakers mounted on trucks. They broadcasted these sounds day and night. At night, the valley echoed with mechanical noise as if hundreds of Shermans were lining up by the river. By day, radio operators mimicked communications between fake battalion commanders, complete with code words and encrypted chatter. German listening posts intercepted the messages and concluded that a major, Allied assault was forming north of Dusseldorf. The bait was set. Inside German command centers, the deception worked perfectly. Reports flooded in from reconnaissance aircraft confirming massed armor near Viersen. Commanders assumed the Americans planned to cross the Rhine there and moved additional artillery and reserve forces north to counter. What they didn't know was that the real U.S. Ninth Army was preparing its crossing miles south. As the Ghost Army kept up the performance, rotating fake patrols, lighting cookfires, even staging mock supply deliveries, the actual combat engineers and armored divisions quietly assembled for the real attack. Then, on the night of March 23, 1945, under cover of the illusion, the Ninth Army launched Operation Plunder, the real crossing of the Rhine. The Germans were looking the wrong way. To maintain the illusion during the real assault, the Ghost Army created a breathtaking sight. Rows of fake landing lights were placed along the riverbanks, simulating a massive pontoon bridge under construction. Searchlights swept the night sky, creating the illusion of activity and movement. Artillery sound effects boomed through the speakers. Fires were set along the horizon to imitate bombardment. To anyone watching from the German side, it looked and sounded like the Rhine was being crossed in force. But when the Germans fired back, their shells fell harmlessly into empty fields. Meanwhile, 20 miles south, the real Allied forces had already secured their bridgeheads. By the time the ruse ended, the German command had completely misread Allied intentions. Their reinforcements, thousands of men, dozens of heavy guns, and several panzer units were sent north to confront an army that didn't exist. In just 48 hours, the real crossings had succeeded with minimal resistance. The path to the Ruhr industrial region, Germany's last major stronghold, lay open. When the truth emerged, Allied generals were astonished by the scale of success. It wasn't merely camouflage, it was theater of war, a deception so convincing it had reshaped the enemy's strategic thinking. When the real Ninth Army linked up with British forces on the eastern bank, Germany's western defenses began to crumble. Within weeks, Allied troops were marching toward the Elbe. For the Ghost Army, their mission ended as quietly as it began. No medals, no parades. Their operations remained classified for decades. Only in 1996 did the U.S. government finally declassify their work. Historians would later estimate that their illusions saved between 15,000 and 30,000 lives by convincing the enemy to fight phantoms instead of men. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, cities reduced to ash, fields scarred by shellfire, millions dead. But amid the wreckage stood one invisible monument, the legacy of the soldiers who fought without bullets. The men of the Ghost Army had waged war with shadows. They had tricked enemy generals, diverted divisions, and protected thousands all through illusion. They never fired in anger. They never killed a man. Yet their work helped win a continent. For decades, their story remained buried under classification. While veterans of infantry, armor, and air received medals, these men carried their memories quietly, their operations unspoken, their sketches and sound reels hidden in attics and footlockers. Only when the files were opened half a century later did the world realize what they had done. In 2022, the U.S. Congress finally awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, honoring not just their courage but their creativity. The recognition came late, but it came with understanding that war is not only fought with firepower, but with intellect, imagination, and restraint. Today, their methods live on in every modern deception unit, from digital camouflage to psychological operations, proof that their ideas transcended the battlefield. Their greatest victory was not in destruction, but in protection. Not in what they destroyed, but in what they saved. As dawn broke over Europe in the spring of 1945, the same kind of dawn that once hid their illusions, it carried with it a quiet truth, that sometimes the sharpest weapon a soldier can wield is the power to make the enemy believe what isn't there. And in that illusion, they found humanity in the heart of war.